Hey guys, how's everyone doing? It's Mark, aka the Arachnoholic, back at it with another video. Today we're going to be talking about spiderlings, aka our baby tarantulas, and how to properly house as well as feed and care for them. So, contrary to popular belief, everybody knows or typically thinks of tarantulas as being these large, gargantuan spiders, and while there are smaller, even dwarf tarantulas, even the largest of these spiders starts off very, very tiny. In fact, some spiderlings, when they first hatch from their eggs, are barely the size of a thumbtack. Now, something to bear in mind when purchasing a spiderling, or a sling, as we sometimes refer to them in the tarantula hobby, is that although they tend to be a lot cheaper, a lot more affordable than our adult or even juvenile individuals, they also have a higher mortality rate, meaning they do die a lot easier and are a bit on the trickier side to keep alive. Not always. There are quite a few hardy species that have equally hardy spiderlings, but as a general rule of thumb, this is why people sell so many spiderlings at once, and a lot of times they're sold at such a cheap rate. And this is also linked to why a lot of tarantulas will lay so many eggs at a time, because we do have to bear in mind that some species, especially some of the larger South American tarantulas, can lay in excess of several hundred to 1,000 eggs at a time. And in the wild, out of those 1,000 eggs, only maybe a handful, maybe a fraction of those spiderlings will really survive all the way to adulthood. So when they first develop, our spiderlings are known as what are called ewls, EWL, which is actually an acronym for eggs with legs, which is basically just a general term used to describe this stage of the tarantula's life where they're pretty much immobile and they basically just look like a white blob with legs. Then they'll molt into first instar spiderlings, where they look a lot more like an actual spider, although they don't have the any sort of coloration or pattern on their body that may resemble their adult form, and the body's pretty much hairless. It's basically just a little white opaque spider with little to no hair on its body. Does not look like a typical tarantula in any way, shape, or form. And at this point in their life, they will also usually stay clustered together. They don't really leave the nest or roam free, nor do they really eat at this point in their lives. They are still living off of the nutrients from their yolk. And then at that point, once they're past that stage, they will molt into their second instar form, which is basically a miniature version of an adult. And they'll start to develop a little bit more color and patterns on their bodies, as well as hair. And it's at this point that they will also begin hunting live prey. So it's important at this point, if we're choosing to artificially incubate our ewls, once they reach second instar spiderlings, that we separate them. Otherwise, they will cannibalize one another. So, what do we keep them in? So, we basically have a couple of different options. available for setups. We have these little shipping vials here, which, as the name suggests, are more often used for shipping spiderlings or smaller arthropods, but they can also be used to house very tiny spiderlings. I would say maybe half an inch or under. They're also great for our arboreal slings, since they have a taller structure to them. We also have some other setups here. There's a few websites where you can get custom built enclosures for spiderling and juvenile tarantulas. I know there's Jamie's Tarantulas, a few other websites that sell some pretty neat enclosures that can be used for terrestrial or arboreal slings. And really the setup is quite basic. I mean, as long as you make sure to provide plenty of ventilation, especially cross ventilation. That's a huge factor, not with just spiderlings, but with any tarantula. It's important to keep them moist and keep them from desiccating or drying out, but at the same time, we do want to give them proper airflow and not create a stuffy cage, because that can actually kill them. And everything else is pretty straightforward, depending on whether it's an arboreal or an obligate burrower or an opportunistic burrower. For my arboreals, I usually just use a twig or a tiny piece of cork bark. Just lean it against one side of the cage, and they'll usually build a web up against it. You can provide water dishes. I definitely do recommend it, although you have to be careful with some of the really tiny spiderlings, as they can drown if the dish is too big for them. But I usually don't run into that problem. And if there is any fear of drowning, I'll usually just take my little spray bottle or syringe, and I'll just spray the sides of the enclosure in one corner or mist the webbing, and the spiderling will drink from that. But bottle caps, especially water bottle caps, make excellent water dishes for our slings. And for obligate burrowers, I like to give them a piece of bark to hide under, even though a lot of times they'll dig in the complete opposite side of the enclosure. But you can actually take a little pencil or a straw or a similar sized object and create a starter burrow to them. And a lot of times they'll take and will build off of that. And last but not least, we have everybody's favorite subject when it comes to caring for their spiders, and that is feed-in time. Now, it can be a little bit tricky to find appropriate sized food for our slings, as many of them are easily intimidated by larger prey. And we also want to pick them something that is not going to fight back and possibly injure or kill them, as larger crickets and mealworms are more than capable of eating our spiderlings. So we do have to bear that in mind when selecting appropriate sized prey items for them. So one really great thing about spiderlings is that almost all of them will scavenge and will accept pre-killed prey as long as it is somewhat fresh. So we can actually take if we don't have any tiny crickets on hand, we can actually take a medium or a large cricket and either crush its head, incapacitate it so that it can't bite or harm the spiderling in any way, and we can cut it up and feed it to them in pieces. which I know sounds a little gruesome, and granted, some people are not gonna be fond of the thought of doing that to the cricket, which I understand. But that is one option. As for live prey, they will gladly accept flightless fruit flies, although those can be sometimes a bit of a pain in the butt to manipulate, in my experience. But those are an option. We also have pinhead crickets, which are just very, very tiny young crickets. We have small mealworms that we can give them as well. Although we must be careful about having mealworms in the enclosure, as if they manage to escape the spider before it can get to them and burrow into the substrate, they can actually resurface while the spider is molten and do some pretty serious damage. So if you're gonna feed mealworms, it's suggested that you either crush the head or incapacitate them in some way before placing them in the spiderling's enclosure for them to eat. Well, guys, that's all for today. Please let me know what you thought of this video in the comments, and definitely feel free to check out my Patreon also. I upload a lot of early access content there, and I'm also planning on doing some live streams as well, if anybody's interested in checking that out. Until then, this has been Mark, aka the Arachnoholic. Stay awesome.